One of the great things about Excel is you can put data anywhere in any format, and this flexibility means you can use it for almost anything, from financial models right through to art. But this also means most people store their data in the wrong layout, and this prevents you from using Excel's built-in tools that are designed to make your life easy. Instead, you end up writing long, complicated formulas that make your head hurt just to wrangle your data to do what you want. It's also the number one reason people struggle with pivot tables. In this video, I'm going to unveil the 5 most common layout mistakes people make when storing data in Excel. I'll explain why they're problematic, and then I'll show you the correct way to store your data so you can skyrocket your productivity. So stick around to the end. By the way, the third format is the one you should avoid at any cost. You might think that this data layout is great because it's nicely organized into units and order amounts by region, and we have totals, which supposedly should make your life easier. I call this layout the semi-report. A semi-report is data that has some degree of summarization already applied. Here there are columns for totals, and we have columns that group the data, in this case, into regions, but it could also be other attributes like weeks or months or years, etc. Also, the column labels are split over 2 rows, which is a big no-no. Column D is empty, and if there were empty rows, they'd also be problematic, as are rows containing subtotals and, like we have here, a grand total. Having totals and subtotals in your source data risks double counting errors. Now, data in this layout will not work with the pivot table. If we try, and let's select the data and click OK, we get an error. And this is because pivot tables can't work with data containing blank columns or duplicate column labels. In this dataset, we have units and order amount repeated 3 times each. We also can't have column labels split over multiple rows. Plus, with this layout, you can't easily change the way the data is summarized. For example, what if your boss wanted you to change the view so that it was summarized by year like this? It would take a considerable amount of time to rearrange this data into this format. But when your data is stored in the correct layout, you can do this with a pivot table in seconds, which I'll show you later in the video. The next layout I often see is what I call the flat data table. Now, a flat data table does some things right, including having the column labels on one row, and they don't have any blank rows or columns. And if we go to the bottom, you can see there's no grand total, nor are there any subtotals. But like the semi-report, they still have some degree of summarization or grouping already applied, with separate columns for the countries in this case. Plus, we have columns for the totals. This layout is dangerous because Excel will allow you to create a pivot table from this data, but you'll struggle to get the desired results, and you'll come away feeling like pivot tables are too hard to use and don't make sense, when in fact, they're one of the easiest tools to use and much quicker and easier than writing formulas. For example, here, I've built a pivot table based on the correct data layout. You can see I'm able to summarize the units and order amounts by year and country in a nicely structured report. But when I try to build the same pivot table based on the flat data table layout, I'm not able to group the units and order amounts into 2 columns. And this is because the data is already split into columns by country in the source data, and that restricts how I can summarize the data. At best, I can summarize it with the years going down the rows and then separate columns for units and order amounts by country. Therefore, if I want my data in this layout, the only option I have is to summarize my data using formulas, which takes way more than a few seconds that it took to create this pivot table. And I'd better hope my boss doesn't change their mind and ask for it in a different layout. So by having this grouping of data by countries in the source data, I've hindered my ability to use pivot tables to rapidly build reports. Next, we have the worst type, the report format. Often, third-party systems attempt to help by providing you with a series of default reports, all nicely formatted, of course. Unfortunately, these reports often fall short of what you actually need. Now, aside from the inflexible layout, these reports lack granularity, instead presenting summarized data which can obscure important details and nuances. Now, without access to raw data or granular information, it's impossible to perform in-depth analysis and reliably identify trends or outliers. And this is why most third-party apps also have an export to Excel button. The data entry format gets its name from the intuitive layout, which makes it easy for the person keying in the data without consideration for any further analysis requirements that you might have. This is perhaps the most frequent mistake I see people make, and the one I get the most questions about, because people try to summarize this data with functions they think should work, like sumifs and countifs, etc. But when your data is in the wrong format, you can't use these functions the way they're intended. And this limitation becomes especially aggravating when dealing with large data sets that span multiple columns for time periods and the like. Last but not least, another common data layout mistake is having separate worksheet tabs, or worse, separate workbook files for each month, year, region, department, salesperson, etc. This is a back-to-front way to store your data because invariably you want to summarize it, which is difficult to do when it's spread over multiple sheets, whereas it's easy to store your data in one sheet and then generate those separate sheets with the click of a couple of buttons. Okay, now that we've seen the pitfalls of the various data layouts, it's time to reveal the correct way to store your data in Excel, and that is to use a tabular layout. A tabular layout's typically at a granular level of detail, often transactional. That is, every row represents one transaction, and you have separate columns for each data type. When you start at this bottom level of detail, it's easy to summarize or slice and dice your data into any combination with pivot tables and functions like sumifs and countifs, etc. For example, from the data in a tabular layout, I can quickly insert a pivot table, and I'll just put it on a new sheet, and we'll recreate the semi-report view of the data. So here I want the country in the columns, I want the order date, and I'm just going to Control Z to undo the grouping that automatically applied. I want the order ID, and then the salesperson, and I want to summarize units and order amount. Let's just change the layout on the Design tab to show it in a tabular format. We'll get rid of the subtotals, and we'll repeat the item labels. And now I have my data in exactly the same format as the semi-report in just a few clicks. Or if you prefer, we can view it in the report layout. To do that, we can take the order ID out, we'll switch the country and the order date. Let's right-click the date and we'll change the grouping from months to years. Let's change the report layout to show it in compact form and pop the subtotals at the bottom of the group. Let's insert a blank line after each item, and we'll tidy up the headers. We'll just call this units, and I'll add a space on the end just to differentiate it from the field list name. This one's order amount with a space. And just like that, we have our report layout. See how fast it was to change it? And that's because we started with our data in the correct tabular layout. But when you skip this fundamental step and start with data that's already summarized or even partially summarized, it's much more difficult to change your report format. And it often means you can't use a lot of the built-in Excel tools and functions the way they're intended, as we saw earlier. This kills productivity and causes a lot of headaches, can be easily avoided if you just set your data up correctly from the outset. The rules for tabular data are every record is housed in one row. Each column contains one type of data, for example, regions, salespeople, dates, etc. There are no blank columns or blank rows, although I should point out that blank rows aren't the end of the world, but they will make your life more difficult than it needs to be. You also need column labels in one cell per column and in a single row. That is, not split over multiple rows, and definitely no merged cells. There are no subtotals interspersed in your data and no grand totals. Now, I know that you often have no choice but to make it easy for people to perform their data entry tasks, which prevents you from using a tabular layout. Or maybe you have legacy systems that simply won't provide the data in any other format than their predefined reports. In which case, you can keep your data in one of these formats that are terrible for analysis and reporting, and instead use Power Query to automate converting a copy of the data into a format you can use in your reports. That way you can boost productivity by using pivot tables and functions the way they're intended. So check out this video next on how to use Power Query to convert 4 common data layouts into the ideal tabular layout for easy analysis and reporting. And don't forget to subscribe for more data adventures. I'll see you in the next video.